let's talk about Georgia. We've been hearing a lot about Georgia in the news of late. A couple weeks ago, a Georgia grand jury issued an indictment accusing Donald Trump of trying to illegally overturn the 2020 presidential election. Why did Trump and his cronies so aggressively target Georgia in their efforts to find votes? Well, because it's one of those swing states, sometimes voting red, sometimes blue. And while Trump's clumsy demands to quote unquote find voters in his favor did not win him the 2020 election, there are more sneaky, devious, and unfortunately successful ways of gaming the electoral system. As a case in point, in the 2018 Georgia state election for governor, the Republican approach was to prevent would-be opponents, and especially targeting Black voters, from reaching the polls at all. Or, if a vote was cast, to try to disqualify it so it was never counted. And that strategy, unfortunately, that one did work. And now with the critical election year coming up, what can we do to protect our right to vote? Well, the first step is to be informed. And to that end, I'm so pleased to introduce our first guest, who is an expert on this subject, Greg Palast. Greg is known for his investigative reports for The Guardian, BBC Television, Rolling Stone, and his string of New York Times bestsellers, including The Best Democracy Money Can Buy and Billionaires and Ballot Bandits. His latest film is called Vigilante, Georgia's Vote Suppression Hitman. That's narrated by Rosario Dawson and produced by Martin Sheen. And it features Greg and his investigations team as they bust the most brazen, racist attack on voting rights yet, engineered by good old Georgia's Brian Kemp to ensure his victory over Stacey Abrams in 2018. And spoiler alert, he has a new documentary that's in the works about the Koch brothers. And we'll hear about that in a moment. Greg Palast, welcome to the Lawyers Guild Show.
I'm always happy to be with my lawyers, especially if they're gilded.
Yes,
my problem isn't one personal note. If you're listening to this radio, put on your mask because I just tested positive for COVID.
Oh dear, I'm sorry to hear that.
Oh, no. I know you've been traveling.
Yeah.
Yes.
That'll get
Well,
you. How you feeling? You feel all right?
I feel like, no, I feel terrible.
Oh, Jesus.
But this is important.
Oh,
and it's not a big sacrifice. I could be, but I just want to let people know, please, the new booster comes out next week.
Yeah.
And for any of my fans, please don't ask me for an autograph this week.
Yeah.
All right. Now, but I am going to, and before I forget, I will make another appeal to you.
Yes.
Because I know we're not in fund drive.
No.
Which is unusual. I know it's like it's a holiday or something at KPFK, but I do want to say we're going to talk about what's happening in Georgia, which is what's happening in America, because once again, like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times say, this election in 2024 will come down again to Georgia. Ooh. And I have a film, Vigilante, Georgia's Vote Suppression Hitman. Now, this film tells you how Donald Trump almost took Georgia, 11,000 votes short. The only way he won, in fact, I actually have to say your sister Pacifica station, WRFG, said if it weren't for Palast and investigation teams and our work, no way that Warnock would have won re-election, and certainly no way that Biden would have won Georgia. And I'm not partisan. I want you to understand that. You know what? You pick your own president. You want to vote for Trump? You want to vote for Godzilla or Brian Kemp or anyone else, Stacey Abrams? That's not my job. That's the voters' job. My job is to try to expose it when they want to stop voters from voting.
So please do summarize what you and your team discovered, because you really uncovered what nobody else was talking about
That's
how Brian
correct.
Kemp and his allies suppressed votes in Georgia.
Oh, boy, big time. So here's what's going on in this film. Why is it called Vigilante? Because Brian Kemp, who's been lauded and lionized by everyone from MSDNC to the New York Times to 60 Minutes, is the guy who stood up against Trump, which he did not do. That's apocryphal. That's wrong. That never, ever, ever happened. He is the vote suppressor in chief of Georgia. So in this film, we did a short film for Leonardo DiCaprio back in 2018 showing how, are you ready? 334,344 voters were illegally removed from the voter rolls. I just want to repeat that. That's a third of a million voters in 2018 when Brian Kemp was running against Stacey Abrams. So a third of a million voters. Now, who were they? Now, that's numbers. And it's just true. It's what we call the Anne Frank effect in journalism, which is you need a name and a face. If you go to gregpalast.com, you will see the face, Christine Jordan. I was at the polling station 2018 when Christine Jordan was told, you don't live in Atlanta anymore. You can't vote here. And her granddaughter was in tears. The woman was in her walker, 92 years old, and they threw her behind out of the polling station into a major storm, by the way.
Yeah.
So I went to the house in Atlanta down the street where she supposedly didn't live anymore. And there on the wall was a picture of Martin Luther King at her dinner table. I said, you had dinner with Martin Luther King? She says, every Sunday. He was my cousin. And this was the 50th year. And so I know she's been living in the house at least 50 years because that was a picture of him at that house. So that's the people. So that's one name, but out of 1/3 Now, many, many more, and not surprisingly, almost everyone not white. But they had a lot of white Atlantans because, Atlanta is kind of San Francisco of the Deep South, outside of New Orleans. So hipsters, LGBT community, those people, voters of color, and the color is blue, Democrats. Again, I'm not partisan. I'm just saying who they went after.
Yep.
Now, that elected Brian Kemp as governor. And one thing that really pisses me off is when you get Kemp and these other Republicans saying, well, what's the difference between Donald Trump and Stacey Abrams both saying the elections were stolen? They're both election deniers. This has been a big, big problem, by the way, for me with the liberal press, with YouTube. If I say that the election was stolen from Stacey Abrams, they take down my YouTubes. I did a report on this for Democracy Now! And Google YouTube removed it.
Unbelievable.
Because, we're supposedly election deniers. No, we're investigators of vote suppression, which not only did we prove, we actually went to court before Judge Stephen Jones, who you may know is the guy who may be the judge in the in the Trump racketeering case. Mm-hmm. And Jones said, look, it's no question. The state's records are just all wrong. I want you to deal with sit down Black Voters Matter and their expert, Mr. Palast, and get this straightened out. Mm-hmm. Now, that's 2018 and 2020. Same tricks, this illegal removal of voters. That ain't nothing. Why is the film called Vigilante? It's because after the Trump lost re-election, Georgia legislature passed and Brian Kemp designed a bill called SB 202, which is kind of I call it the holy grail of vote suppression. It has everything in it to stop people of color from voting, including a provision that says, are you ready for this? That any voter can challenge an unlimited number of other voters if they say that they have some evidence that those voters are not legal voters. Mm-hmm. What happened in the 2020 election? The answer was, and then later in 2022, but in 2020, it started where they challenged 250,000 voters. Who are they? 88 Republican operatives. Now, I'm not being partisan. Mm-hmm. Not one single Democrat challenged another voter's vote. Not one challenge by a Democrat or by an independent. 88 challenges by Republican operatives, including chairmen of counties, etc. Mm-hmm. And you'll see in our film, you'll meet some of these people. And when I call them vigilantes, they love it. In fact, the chairman of the Georgia GOP in southern Georgia, he actually dresses up as a vigilante. He dresses up. You'll see in the film, he dresses up as Doc Holliday, cowboy hat, boots, 6-gun, which, by the way, you'll see this pearl-handled 45. Yeah. In our film. That thing was loaded. Mm-hmm. And he made a point of telling you it was loaded. So we were a bit nervous doing this interview because what he didn't know, and you'll see in the film, the guy he had personally challenged 4,000 voters, almost all of them from Fort Benning, Georgia. These are soldiers whose votes he challenged, black soldiers whose votes he challenged, including Major Gamaliel Turner. Now, Gamaliel Turner is the Pentagon's warfare of the future expert. You have to think about the next wars, right? Yeah. So but his crime was being African American and being assigned by the President of the United States at that time, Mr. Trump, to Fort Hueneme in California. So here's a soldier being assigned by the president to Fort Hueneme, and his vote is challenged by the Republican Party. That's what they're doing. They're challenging soldiers. So I invited Mr. Doc Holliday, who challenged 4,000 voters. And I asked him, did he go to any of their houses? He said, these people don't live in Georgia anymore. Well, of course, because he had a home, the major, there, but he was assigned temporarily to California. I said, oh, they don't live in Georgia. They shouldn't vote here. I said, did you call any of them? No. Did you go to any of their homes to see if they are still living there and temporarily, a student or on vacation or in the military? No.
Or on duty somewhere, right?
Yeah. So I said, by the way, do you know whose house you're in? He said, no. I said, meet your host, Major Gamaliel Turner, U.S. military expert. Say hello to the major. And we were a bit worried. The major was very worried because he only had 2 weapons in the house in case this guy got rambunctious and decided to use his gun. And we always have to face that. If you watch Greg Palast films, we're always facing. By the way, in case you want to know, I never try to provoke people into hitting me, running at me, shooting at me. That stuff happens.
Yeah, the
and
truth
you get it on
is
camera, but I try not to. I don't look for trouble, believe me. So Gamaliel, the only weapons in the house, in case the guy started firing, was a gun inside his mother's Bible. His father is one of the minister who helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They kept a gun in every Bible. And he said, but that thing hasn't been fired in 50 years. So then he thought, well, he only had one other weapon in the house, which I'm sure I don't think he'll be happy. He had this brand new anti-tank weapon he was designing for Ukraine. I thought that might be a little bit much if there's a problem to pick up this anti-tank weapon.
But Greg, let me interrupt you for a minute. I'm going to tell you why. There's so much we need to ask you about, my friend.
Yes.
We've got to move on. But I know from talking to you that what happened in Georgia is not an isolated incident of people trying to keep honest and actual voters from voting. So, and we also want to get to, the whole fight that you've been engaged in for so long, with respect to the Koch brothers and the theft of the Osage Nation's oil. But so before we get to that, give us a quick overview of how this problem exists beyond Georgia, my friend, sadly.
Unfortunately, that's why we are re-releasing the film next year, because it's now spread the Georgia disease because no media attacked it, these vigilante voting challenges. So now it's moved to Texas. I was just in Texas. I was in Arizona. I was in Oklahoma and Nevada. And this stuff is spreading with these Republican legislatures where, this vigilante challenge stuff where people have absolutely no basis for these challenges, but they mount tens of thousands. One woman in Georgia personally challenged 33,000 people. She was heavily armed, by the way, you'll see in the film, and she comes after me. Yeah. Again, I'm not trying to do that. It's just when you get asked uncomfortable questions. So it is traveling around the nation. We expect it to be a major factor in the outcome of the next election, because remember, in Arizona, where they've now expanded this type of game, Biden won by 10,000 votes, Nevada by 10,000 votes. We've been to Wisconsin as well, which Biden won by another 10,000 votes, and of course 11,000 votes in Georgia. All those 3 states, you've got a big, big problem. So if these vote suppression tactics work, suppression, not the voters, will pick the next president. You want to vote for Trump? Fine. But if you want to stop someone else from voting, that's not fine. No. Now, moving to this next topic, and they're all related.
Oh, yeah.
And all the stuff is related. Because someone is funding this stuff. Vote suppression ain't cheap. So there's a guy who I don't know if you ever heard of him. His name, when I first started investigating, no one had ever heard of him. His name is Charles Koch.
That's right.
And I first did an investigation of him in 1996 and then later for The Guardian. And I mentioned that he and his brother David were the richest guys you'd never heard of. Now we've heard of them.
Oh, yeah.
But here's what you don't know, or most people don't know, unless you've read my books like Best Democracy Money Can Buy or Billionaires and Ballot Bandits. What happened was in 96, I get a call that on the Osage Indian Reservation in Oklahoma. Now, the Osage Nation, there's now going to be a gigantic film out about them called Killers of the Flower Moon, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, who's involved with our work. His father, George DiCaprio, is now producing a film to follow up. Because what happened there in 1920s, the largest oil strike in American history was found on the Osage Reservation. And for a very short time, the Osage were the richest people on the planet, richer than any other Americans as a group. They were the richest ethnic group in the world for a couple of years. Because what the U.S. government then did is say, oh, Indians, they're incompetent. We have to treat them as children. They can't handle their own affairs, even though you had one vice president of the United States who was Osage. Yeah. Maria Tall Chief, the great prima ballerina, was Tall Chief because her father was Tall Chief, the Tall Chief. So Maria Tall Chief. These are sophisticated people. But they said, no, we have to treat them like children, so we're going to give them each white guardians. Every Osage got a white guardian. And those Osage, the government said the Osage Nation can't own the oil, just these individuals with guardians. The guardians got their wards, some of them who couldn't speak any English, to sign documents turning over their oil rights to their guardians on their death. And then their guardians simply killed them, put bullets in their head, dynamited one house, poisoned them, stabbed them, ran them over with cars, threw the babies out the windows of cars. I'm not making this stuff up, by the way. And they killed maybe up to 160 Osage for their oil. That's not where the story ends. That's where that movie ends. That is, Killers of the Flower Moon ends in 1923. However, it's now 100 years. What happened to the Osage? They didn't disappear. So they are very concerned that I make a movie with the DiCaprio family showing what's happened in the next 100 years. And what mainly happened to them is something called Coke oil. So after they got ripped off for all their major oil holdings, so now they're dirt poor. But they have a few what are called stripper wells on their land, but it's so little oil, like a couple barrels a month on these little stripper wells, which you see those rocking horses, it's tiny ones. And so Coke oil, the Bureau of Indian Affairs signed a deal with Coke oil to pick up the stripper well oils. They do it by picking it up with trucks because it's too little to put in a pipe. So they pick it up in trucks. Well, here's the thing. They would pick up 100 barrels of oil from several wells and write down 80 and keep the 20 for Coke. And it ended up, the theft was way over $1 billion of Osage oil and American oil, because a lot of those lands are also U.S. government lands. So you and I, the taxpayer, got our oil ripped off from us with the Osage. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs did absolutely nothing. And then there was a FBI, a senator, and I'll give you credit, Senator John McCain and Senator Dennis DeConcini, one Republican, one Democrat, said this will not stand. So they had sent out the FBI's top agent. When I say top agent, I mean he's the top agent at the FBI, Richard Elroy, who photographed the theft and got confessions from 50 Coke employees and managers. Confessions saying, Charles Koch personally ordered us to steal this oil. We didn't get any of it. He got it all.
Wow.
And there was an indictment then drawn up. They had the hearings. Senator DeConcini was told by Robert Strauss, the head of the Democratic Party, that Charlie Koch hired the chairman of the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican minority leader, Bob Dole. Dole worked out on McCain, threatened him, and Strauss threatened DeConcini, saying that Koch will spend anything to destroy you. And in fact, if you say that Koch stole oil from the Osage, he issued the report that Koch stole oil, and that was the end of DeConcini's political career. They did exactly what they said. They spent whatever it took to destroy him. And McCain barely survived through that.
When is that? Greg, I'm just sitting here. When is that film? I know you're working on it, and I'm not trying to rush you, but I want to see it. When's it coming out?
It'll come out sometime at the beginning of next year in coordination with the feature movie Killers of the Flower Moon. So we're just working out the timing.
Oh, wonderful.
So it will be, understand, this is, our producer is George DiCaprio, and Leonardo's dad, who's, but it doesn't happen without, this film is being made at the special request of Principal Chief Standing Bearer of the Osage. He wants the story. He wants it. It's important to the Osage, as they put it. We didn't just disappear 100 years ago at the end of this book, Killers of the Flower Moon. And we're thrilled that story is being told. But we want you to know what Koch did to us and what the Bureau of Indian Affairs continues to do from us. Yes, they got rid of Koch, but it's more ripoffs. They're subtle. There's a lot of pollution and poisoning that goes on there, and they don't have control of their own reservation properties, because even though they're the only native group which actually bought their property, they purchased their reservation property. Nevertheless, the U.S. government has said that they are mentally incompetent, can't run their own affairs, and so it's all run by Washington.
So it is are they still not getting the oil or any benefit of their oil?
Yes, they're getting more and more benefit because they're doing everything that they can to try to control it. Yeah. And in fact, actually, interestingly, the Bureau of Indian Affairs would not let the Osage drill their own oil. They said, you have to sell it to an oil company like Exxon or Arco or whoever. Yeah. You have to sell to them. You can't drill yourself. So they said, well, what if so they created a corporation called Osage Oil. And they said, well, you're going to stop us from bidding for our own property? So they began, and you'll see the difference. When you go to a pump that the Bureau of Indian Affairs controls, it's filth, it's oil right over big streams and over the water supplies. Just the grease and methane is pouring out of these wells into the atmosphere. Jeez. You go to the few pumps controlled and owned by the Osage, and you could eat lunch on those pumps. I mean, because they say, well, I say, why? Why would you spend all this extra money? Just take the crap out of the ground. What do you care? And they say, because we're not tourists.
You live there, right?
We live here. This is our land, and we don't want our kids to be poisoned. In fact, our goal is to eliminate oil. We have geothermal resources and replace this with geothermal wells. So this is the fight. It's about Coke oil, and it's about the contemporary story of the fight. This whole business. And again, you've got the problem of Coke oil. Until Charlie Koch was facing indictment in the Osage oil theft case. And there was an indictment written up and it got quashed. That will be in the movie, how that happened. Mm-hmm. How do you do that when you have photographic evidence of the crime? Yeah. Well, and he got the indictment quashed, but that caused him to start what is now the Kochtopus, the massive political machine. Yeah. Yeah. And also funding the massive climate denial operation. So that's what's happening. That's coming. Oh my goodness. But you can't separate stealing oil from the Osage and the theft of votes. And by the way, they make that point very clearly. They say, like in Arizona, the Republican legislature removed the polling stations from the Yaqui Pascua tribe. Now, I didn't say they reduced the number of polling stations. They eliminated them. No polling stations, none in 2020. The only way that Biden won by a few votes in Arizona is that the Osage and other tribes came in and helped them organize a massive vote mail-in campaign in Arizona among the tribes. And that's what shocked the Republicans, because they should have won Arizona, but then suddenly they got this massive native vote, which is about 90+% Democratic.
Yeah, well, if you got a real democracy, things like that happen. And they knew that was going to happen, and that's why they didn't want it to happen and did the criminal acts and the other things they did to try to stop it from happening. But the Native Americans were strong enough to resist. And you're wonderful enough to have done the film. I mean, I've thanked you on the air before, but your history of doing this kind of work is just so commendable. Sadly, we've talked about Assange on this show. We've talked about we've talked about what's happening to free press in America today. Goodness knows it's getting tougher and tougher for people like you to even exist. And you do, and you keep coming out with these amazing films. As I say, I can't wait for that one, because I knew a little bit about what was going on with the Osage and the oil, but nothing compared to what I know your film's going to show me, and I've always been interested in it. Well, Greg Palast, what can I say? We're going to have to kind of move on. Last thoughts, Greg?
Well, last thoughts are, if you want the follow-ups on what's going on with the last film, this film, with the Osage, go to gregpalast.com. That's GREG, PALAST, gregpalast.com. Sign up for they only come every few weeks, a note about some issue and notices of the film's availability, etc. We don't bombard you with crap. Okay, so I'll thank you so much.
No. And my friend, you're doing it with a little bout of COVID again. Get over it quickly. I insist. We can't afford to have you laying around doing nothing. I laugh as I say that, because the last time you laid around doing nothing, you were about a week old, I think. I don't know. Maybe you were.
I had my little reporter hat and pencil. You'd be shocked.
Not really. Greg Palast, really. I mean, you're a friend of this show, a friend of the station, and a friend of everybody who cares about real democracy and what's going on in this country with your films. We just thank you for being with us. Be well, my friend. Get well, my friend, and we'll have you back from time to time, I'm sure. And now we're going to take
so much.